The church was full, every pew packed with guests in pressed suits and silk dresses. White roses lined the aisle. A string quartet played softly near the altar. Everything looked exactly the way a fairy tale wedding should look. And then it happened. In front of 200 people, in front of the cameras, in front of God himself, a woman walked up to the bride, grabbed the veil from her head, and placed it on another woman, standing just feet away. No warning, no apology, just silence. And then gasps so loud they echoed off the cathedral walls. The bride stood frozen at the altar, her hands shaking, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. The groom, the man she had given 3 years of her life to, stood there and said nothing, did absolutely nothing. And the woman who did it? She smiled, straightened the veil on the other woman's head, turned to the congregation and said, "This is how it was always supposed to be." What that woman didn't know, did what nobody in that church knew, was who that bride's father was, what he owned, what he was capable of, and exactly how much patience he had left. By the end of this story, a wedding would be cancelled, a family empire would be threatened, and one woman's cruelty would cost people everything they had spent decades building. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end at that altar. It's just where it begins. There is a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with raised voices or broken dishes. It comes dressed in silk, standing in a cathedral with 200 witnesses watching. It comes with a smile on its face and a plan it rehearsed in private. And when it lands so completely, so publicly, so deliberately, that the person it happens to has exactly 2 choices. Fall apart in front of everyone, or straighten their back and walk away like they own the ground they're standing on. Claire Whitfield chose to walk, and everything that followed from that single choice, the phone calls, the financial dominoes, the quiet devastation of an entire family's carefully constructed future, everything that followed started in the moment she straightened her spine at that altar and refused to give Margaret Harlow the satisfaction of watching her crumble. But to understand what happened after that Saturday in May, you have to understand what happened before it. You have to understand who Claire really was, who her father really was, and why a man worth more than most people could count had spent 3 years sitting quietly in the background, watching and waiting. Claire grew up in a modest house in Millbrook, Ohio. She rode her bike to school. She packed her own lunches. Her mother, Diane, was a hospital nurse who worked double shifts during the winter months and still had dinner on the table by 7. Her father, Gerald, left early every morning in the same dark blue sedan and came home after dark most nights. He wore plain clothes, he drove used cars. He never talked about money the way people who have it often can't help doing. What Gerald talked about, when he talked at all, was character. What a person does when no one is watching. How you treat people who can't do anything for you. Whether your word means something or whether it's just noise you make to buy yourself time. Claire absorbed all of it. By the time she was a young woman, she had become something rare in the world her father quietly moved through. A person with absolutely no performance to maintain. What you saw with Claire was what she was. She worked as a hospital administrator in Columbus because her mother had been a nurse, and hospitals felt like places where real things happened. She drove a used Honda with a cracked dashboard she kept meaning to fix. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment and paid her rent on time and knew all her neighbors by name. Nobody who met her at work, or at the coffee shop near her building, or at the hospital fundraisers she helped organize would have looked at her and thought anything other than, there is a good, grounded, ordinary woman living an ordinary life. That was, of course, exactly what Gerald had intended me to, because Gerald Whitfield was not ordinary. Gerald Whitfield had started buying distressed commercial real estate in the Midwest in the late 1980s when everyone else was running the other direction. He had held properties through downturns that broke other investors, through recessions that emptied office parks and shuttered factories, through years when the phone barely rang and the spreadsheets looked brutal. He had held because he understood something that most people in that industry either couldn't see or couldn't tolerate: that value and price are not the same thing, and that patience is the most underrated asset a person can own. By the time Claire was finishing college, Gerald's holding company controlled a portfolio valued at just over $3 billion. By the time she was 32 and standing in that cathedral in her wedding dress, that number had grown considerably. But you would never have known it from anything Gerald owned or drove or wore or said. He had built his wealth in near total privacy, and he intended to keep it that way. He had one reason for the privacy that mattered more than all the others. Her name was Claire. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories on DarkMind Tales. Gerald had watched what money did to families, not from a distance, up close, in real time, at dinner tables and in boardrooms and at funerals where the tears were half grief and half calculation. He had watched inheritances hollow people out, watched grown children become experts at performing warmth toward a parent they were quietly waiting to outlive. He had watched marriages form around balance sheets and dissolve the moment the numbers changed. And he had decided, with the same clarity he brought to his business decisions, that his daughter would not live inside that particular distortion. She would know who she was before she knew what she had. And she would learn to read people the way he had learned to read people, by watching what they did when the stakes were real and there was nothing obvious to gain. So, Claire grew up never advertising her last name in any meaningful way. When she met Thomas Harlow at a hospital fundraiser in the fall of 2021, she introduced herself as Claire, just Claire. Thomas was tall and sharp-dressed, and he had the easy confidence of a man who had grown up in a comfortable house and had never had a serious reason to doubt himself. He worked at his family's investment firm, Harlow Capital, out of Cincinnati. He was attentive in the early months, calling when he said he would call, showing up when he said he would show up, remembering small things she had mentioned and bringing them back into conversation in ways that felt considered. Claire was careful, the way her father had raised her to be careful, but Thomas was consistent. And after a year together, she allowed herself to believe that what she was feeling was real, and that what he was showing her was who he actually was. Gerald ran a background check on Thomas Harlow within the first 2 months. It was a habit, thorough, quiet, professionally conducted, and what came back gave him 2 things to think about. The first was that Thomas was, on the surface, exactly what he appeared to be. Solid family business, clean record, no obvious red flags. The second was the thing Gerald filed away without acting on: 2 previous serious relationships, both with women from modest backgrounds, both of which had ended abruptly in ways that the women in question had not initiated. Gerald noted it. He watched. He gave Thomas the room a man deserves when he hasn't yet done anything specific to lose it. He told himself he was being fair. He told himself Claire could handle her own life. Thomas proposed in March of 2023. He did it at a restaurant in Columbus with a ring that was tasteful and clearly selected carefully. And Claire said yes with the kind of happiness that comes from believing you have been genuinely chosen. Margaret Harlow was not as subtle. Margaret had grown up in old Cincinnati money, not the spectacular, headline-generating kind, but the established, multi-generational kind that comes with a set of opinions about everything, and a deep conviction that those opinions are simply taste rather than class anxiety with better shoes. She had married well, produced 1 son, and devoted the substantial organizational intelligence she possessed to the management of Thomas's trajectory. She chose his schools, shaped his social circle, guided his professional moves with the light but unmistakable pressure of a woman who had decided her son's success was the primary project of her life. She had a vision for what Thomas's marriage would look like. It had, for years, a name attached to it. That name was Serena Voss. Serena was the daughter of the Voss banking family, Cincinnati old money meeting. Cincinnati old money in a way that Margaret found aesthetically and practically satisfying. Serena was polished, connected, and understood instinctively the social architecture that Margaret had spent decades maintaining. She was, in Margaret's estimation, exactly correct. The problem was that Thomas had met Claire first and found in her something that Serena, with all her credentials, had never quite given him. Something unguarded, something real. Margaret tried in the first year to simply outlast the relationship. She made small comments, never cruel enough to report directly, always pointed enough to register, about backgrounds and compatibility and what a life together really requires beyond the initial feeling. Claire received all of it with a grace that Margaret, to her frustration, could not find fault with publicly. You cannot easily attack a person who refuses to be destabilized. Margaret tried for 2 years, and Claire did not destabilize. When the engagement was announced, Margaret moved from patience to planning. She had a conversation with Serena that nobody else was present for. She made certain logistical arrangements that she kept entirely to herself. What she never did in any of this was ask a single, meaningful question about who Claire's father was. She had looked at Gerald Whitfield across a dinner table and seen a quiet, plainly dressed man with no social profile she could locate and no visible position in any of the circles she moved through. She had made a determination and moved on. It was the most expensive assumption she would ever make. The week before the wedding, Claire noticed the silences. Thomas had always been a man who filled space with easy conversation. But that final week, something had pulled back behind his eyes. He answered her messages slowly. He called once instead of his usual, twice. On Thursday evening, he cancelled dinner with an explanation so vague it had the texture of something prepared rather than something true. Claire noticed. She didn't confront it because she told herself it was pre-wedding nerves. She observed. She filed it. She told herself she would raise it after the wedding. She would never have that conversation, not the one she was planning. The morning of the wedding, she woke at 6 in the hotel room her bridesmaids had booked. She lay still for a few minutes listening to Columbus waking up outside the window. Traffic starting. Birds. The distant sound of a delivery truck on the street below. She tried to name what she was feeling. It was not pure happiness. It was not pure dread. It was something that sat between them, a kind of heightened alertness she couldn't fully explain, as if some part of her was paying attention to something she hadn't consciously identified yet. Gerald arrived at 10. He wore a dark suit and his usual plain watch, and he stood in the doorway of the hotel room and looked at his daughter, and his face did something it very rarely did. It showed everything. He crossed the room and held her for a long moment and said against her hair, "Your mother would have cried the whole drive here." Claire pressed her face into his shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing sufficient to say. The ceremony was scheduled for 11. The cathedral on the east side of Cincinnati was genuinely beautiful. Tall, stained glass windows that turned the light into something sacred. White marble floors. Pews of dark, polished wood. The flowers were white roses everywhere, which had been Claire's choice because they had been Diane's favorite. She stood at the back of the cathedral on her father's arm and looked down the long aisle at Thomas standing at the altar, and she breathed. She chose it. She walked. She did not see, when she passed the second row, that Serena Voss was sitting there. She did not see the barely perceptible nod that passed between Serena and Margaret. She did not see Margaret shift forward slightly in her seat, like a woman positioning herself to stand. She was looking at the altar. She was looking at Thomas. She was choosing to believe in the thing she had spent 3 years building. It is one of the cruelest features of these moments that the people they happen to are almost always, right up until the last second, still choosing to believe. The officiant's name was Pastor David Coleman, and he had been doing this long enough to have seen most things a wedding could produce. He had not seen this. He was 2 sentences into his opening when the movement in his peripheral vision stopped him mid-word. Margaret Harlow was on her feet. She was moving with the calm of a woman who had made a decision and made peace with it. Claire turned when she felt the displacement of air beside her. She turned, and Margaret was already there, already reaching. And the grip was firm and practiced. 2 hands, no hesitation, and the veil came free before Claire's hands could even begin to respond. She made a sound, small and involuntary, like something had been pulled out of her rather than just off of her. Her hands went up and found nothing. Margaret placed the veil on Serena's head with both hands. Slowly, deliberately, with the particular satisfaction of a woman doing something she has been looking forward to for a long time, she adjusted the edges the way a mother adjusts a child's collar before a photograph. Tenderly, proudly, as if this were the moment the morning had always been building toward. Then she turned to the congregation. 200 people in total silence, not one of them breathing normally, and she said it clearly enough that the first 6 rows heard every word without straining. This is how it was always supposed to be. The silence lasted exactly 2 more seconds. Then the cathedral came apart. Claire turned to Thomas. What she saw was not shock. It was not outrage. It was not a man gathering himself to defend the woman he had asked to marry him. It was a man looking at the floor, a man who had known, who had understood what this morning was going to hold and had walked her down the aisle anyway and said nothing. The floor he was staring at was the most honest thing in the room. Gerald reached into his jacket pocket. He took out his phone. He pressed call. The phone rang twice. The call lasted 38 seconds. Gerald's voice throughout it was perfectly level. Claire had already made her decision. She looked at Thomas one final time. One long, clear, cataloguing look. The look of a woman making sure she is seeing what she is actually seeing and not what she hoped for. And then she turned around. She walked back down the aisle the way she had walked up it. Steady pace, shoulders back, eyes forward, not rushing, not performing, just moving through the space with the simple, undefeatable dignity of a woman who has decided this place is no longer worth her presence. Outside, she sat on the top step. Gerald sat beside her. Then Gerald said quietly, "Do you want me to handle this, or do you want to?" Claire said, "You handle it." Gerald nodded once. He made 2 more calls. The video was online before the flowers at the reception venue had begun to wilt. Someone in the congregation had been recording on their phone, the reflexive documentation of modern life, and the clip they captured, 17 seconds long, showed everything that needed to be shown. Margaret's hands closing on the veil, the pull, the sound Claire made, Margaret placing it on Serena with the slow, ceremonial care of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. And then Claire's back as she walked away from the altar. It did not show her crying, because she wasn't crying. It showed her walking, spine straight, head level, not looking back. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the clip had 50,000 views. By 5, it had passed 250,000. By the time most of the wedding guests had gotten home, it was over 1 million, and the comment sections were functioning as a kind of distributed jury that had already reached a unanimous verdict. The phrase that kept appearing across platform after platform was some version of, "She walked out with more class than anyone in that building." The Harlow family's response was a study in how not to manage a crisis. Their statement spoke of long-standing personal circumstances and family decisions made in the context of complex relationships, and it used the word appropriate twice in ways that made people angrier than the original clip had. It mentioned Claire exactly once as a party affected by these circumstances, In language so clinical, it confirmed what the clip had already suggested, that Claire had not been a person to this family. She had been a complication. Thomas gave a television interview 6 days after the wedding. He said he deeply regretted the pain that had occurred. He did not say he was sorry to Claire specifically. He did not mention her name at all. He described the wedding as an event, which is a word that functions as a small act of violence when applied to the worst day of another person's life. What none of them knew was the phone call Gerald had made from those cathedral steps. The person on the other end was Richard Hollis, the managing director of the regional bank that held the primary operating credit facility for Harlow Capital. Gerald had quietly observed that Harlow Capital carried more short-term credit exposure than its revenue comfortably supported. He had filed that away as information. He had not intended to use it. What Margaret Harlow had done on that Saturday morning converted information into something Gerald was now willing to act on. The credit facility review notice arrived at Harlow Capital 10 days after the wedding. For a firm that was not over-leveraged, it would have been an administrative matter. For Harlow Capital, it was something considerably more disruptive. It did not destroy the firm, but it moved things. The floor, which had felt solid, now had some give in it. Gerald also made a call to a financial journalist named Patricia Harmon, who had been trying to profile him for 2 years. He had declined consistently, but now he was willing to talk. The piece ran 16 days after the wedding. It was a profile of a quietly extraordinary businessman whose name most people had never encountered. The photograph showed Gerald standing outside a large commercial property in the grey Cincinnati morning light, wearing his plain dark jacket, looking like exactly what he was, $3 billion of private wealth operating in complete, deliberate obscurity. Margaret Harlow read the article the morning it published. She read it twice, the second time more slowly than the first, the way a person rereads a document they are hoping will somehow change meaning on closer inspection. It did not change meaning. 18 months before that Saturday in May, Gerald's holding company had begun acquiring a parcel of commercial land on Cincinnati's east side through a blind trust. The parcel was a substantial mixed-use development site that the Harlow family had been attempting to build on for 7 years. This development was central to Harlow Capital's 5-year growth strategy. It was the thing they were pointing at when they talked about the future. The blind trust completed its acquisition 6 months before the wedding. The Harlow family had been in active negotiations with that blind trust without ever knowing who was on the other side of the table. They had not known when Margaret was rehearsing what she was going to say when she stood up in that church. When the filings surfaced and a reporter connected the pieces, the comment sections were quieter than after the original clip, not because people were less engaged, but because the story had moved past the place where commentary felt adequate. Some things you watch in silence. This was one of them. Claire went back to work 3 weeks after the wedding. She drove her Honda, brought her lunch, answered her emails. A woman named Sandra stopped her in the hallway and said, "I watched that clip 14 times and every time I watch you walk out I want to applaud." Claire laughed. It was the first real laugh she had since May. She did not give interviews. She did not post on social media. She was actually recovering, which is a different and quieter thing than performing recovery. Gerald told her in one of their conversations that he had waited too long. Claire listened and did not immediately absolve him. She told him she had seen some of the signs herself and had looked away from them. He said it was on both of them. They sat with that for a while. They finished their coffee. There is a moment in the video that millions of people have seen that is easy to miss if you are watching for the drama rather than the truth of it. It is the moment, about 4 seconds, before Claire begins walking away from the altar when she turns one final time toward Thomas. She is not asking him to stop it. She is looking at him the way you look at a door you are about to close for the last time. Not with anger, not with grief, but with a kind of quiet finality that is almost peaceful. She sees him exactly as he is. She turns away. She walks. That 4-second look is the whole story. Everything that followed was just the world catching up to what Claire already knew at the altar. She had seen it. She had processed it. She had made her choice. And she had walked. Now before you go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. Do you think Gerald was right to stay silent as long as he did? Or was his silence its own kind of failure? Drop your thoughts below. This community produces some of the most thoughtful conversation on this platform, and I want to hear where you land. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to DarkMind Tales and hit the notification bell, because the next story involves a man who spent 9 years being told he had nothing, by a family that was secretly building something enormous on his silence. When the truth came out, it didn't just change his life. It ended careers, reopened legal cases, and left a city asking how they had missed it for so long. You do not want to come late to that one. I will see you there.